first met Leon myself only 2 or 3 years ago, and it was the first time I knew that in the modern world there was any distinguished intellectual backing for some ideas that I'd just come across as a businessman for 30 years or so. So we've had a lot of fun together since I've found Leon extremely stimulating. I've learned a tremendous amount from him myself, for which I thank him, and I'm sure we're all looking forward to listening to him this afternoon. Although I find him very stimulating intellectually, I am supposed to point out that his own organisation, the Free Market Foundation, is a bit doubtful of what he might say. And therefore it's apparently been made clear by the executive committee of the foundation that he can only speak for himself. Maybe that's better anyway, but what he's saying is his personal views and not representative necessarily of the position of the Free Market Foundation. Now, you've not come to listen to me, so I'm going to hand you directly over to Leon.
There is one there. Hello, Simon. Yes, this is the probably the most critical session, the one in which I produce what I believe is the solution to the South African situation. I often think that I'm uncomfortable with the way people call it a problem. It's almost as if sort of problems descend upon us from heaven while we're not looking. My own view is we create problems, and the way to solve them is to discontinue causing them. The best treatment for most problems is to stop them, is to cease them. It's like inflation. You know, when we were fighting inflation, there was a lovely Bob Connolly cartoon of a little cartoon figure standing in the street punching aimlessly into the air. And somebody said to him, "What are you doing?" And he said, "I'm fighting inflation." Now, inflation, like political problems, is something you cause. You have inflation if you want it, and you don't have it if you don't want it. These things are deliberate policies, and I believe that so it is with racial conflict and social conflict and economic problems. These are things which human beings have chosen to experience for whatever reason, because they're perhaps mistaken about what the consequences are of alternatives. One of the main reasons why we have problems is because of the extraordinarily absurd Marxist myth, which is almost universally held also by people who don't consider themselves to be Marxists, and that is the zero-sum view of wealth or the negative-sum view of wealth. Most people believe that if some people benefit, other people necessarily are disadvantaged, that one person's gain is another person's loss. In the South African situation, this takes on the obviously wrong dimension that if blacks are disadvantaged, whites are benefited, or conversely, if whites benefit, blacks must be disadvantaged. It is more likely, it seems to me, to be true that the system that disadvantages some also disadvantages others, and that what happens is that the degree of disadvantage is an issue rather than whether there is disadvantage. I have set out, and I'll just recap briefly in the previous sessions, my view of the background to our problems, that the Afrikaner in particular, who is now in power for all practical purposes, is said to have a authoritarian, despotic history. I argued that this is not borne out by the facts, that contrary to that, the Afrikaner's history is one which earned the respect and support of liberals throughout the world during the last century. The Afrikaner established a dozen or more republics, all of which had liberal constitutions in which there were no discriminatory laws, but more importantly in which the powers of government were very, very severely curtailed. Indeed, in most of them, the government simply could not make laws at all because they distrusted endowing governments with the power to make laws as I do, and I would argue that so long as powers as governments anywhere, particularly in our circumstances, are omnipotent in their lawmaking function, necessarily we will have problems, or will anyone have problems? The great success stories in history are countries in which the powers of government were effectively curtailed in some way, either simply because it was difficult for them to make laws, as say in Hong Kong, Japan, Switzerland, the USA. It's simply difficult to make laws, and therefore there aren't many, and in many countries, of course, there are bills of rights. In some countries there are constitutions, like the USA, in which the government can only do those things which it's permitted to do. You don't have the so-called sovereignty of Parliament, which is a Westminster idea. But even in the USA, the government is, in theory, still constrained by documents like the Magna Carta, which is still theoretically a valid binding Bill of Rights or limitation on government. Now, I've circulated to all of you a document. I seem to have lost my own. Oh, here it is. And I'm not going to go in the same detail in my presentation to you through what is in here, which is my view of the case for limiting the power of government in South Africa. I'm going to talk more now about the case for decentralizing the power of government in South Africa. The limited government concept, which is a concept to which all believers in free or near free societies, or as many of us in this room would put it, in free or near free markets, the case for that is something I doubt that needs to be made to people in an audience like this. There can be a lot of discussion as to how you limit the power of government, but that government should be limited is something to which most people of goodwill easily agree. Most people who do not agree to that are simply totalitarian aspirant despots themselves. They imagine themselves to preside over this unlimited almighty state. And that is the only condition, I believe, under which anyone can be in favor of unlimited government, is the completely unrealistic fantasy that you yourself will be able to pull the strings in that government. Previous talks, I also, just to remind you, suggested that South Africa is not a success story, that South Africa is the most richly endowed country in the world per capita with natural resources, that our performance, given the fact that we started industrializing at, say, much the same time as Japan, is a somewhat dismal performance, that South Africa, with the right economic policies, by now should have been the world's Japan, or the world's wealthiest country per capita, quite easily. We had all the necessary endowments, strategic locality, size, population, early in development of industrialization, natural resource endowment, rich agricultural lands, at least in terms of square miles, if not in terms of percentage, and so on. We had all the necessary requirements, access to Western capital and technology, and so on. So South Africa is not a success story. I did make the point that we don't need to lament that too much, because it turns out that with the exception of the USA, every single country that is well endowed with natural resources is actually a dismal performer. The countries that are successful ones turn out to be the ones that are conspicuously devoid of natural endowment. They are landlocked, they are small, they are mountainous, they lack any form of minerals, they are heterogeneous in terms of population or whatever. For example, Switzerland, Singapore, Hong Kong, United Kingdom itself during the Industrial Revolution, places like Liechtenstein, what's that other little one on the east of Switzerland? Luxembourg. That's not Luxembourg, is on the southwest. Anyway, places like this, Taiwan, Singapore, Sri Lanka, they turn out to be countries which one would predict on so-called viability ratings should not perform well. They turn out to be the ones that have performed well. The richly endowed countries, Mexico with more oil than Saudi Arabia, Nigeria, the USSR, China, India, these countries turn out to be very, very dismal performers. So South Africa has not been as bad, if you like, as other richly endowed countries, but certainly with the right policies, one should have been able to be a USA or a Japan, which we weren't. Then also, multi-ethnicity is really no excuse for our problems, because it turns out, I have the figures here if anyone wants more detail. I'm going to make some broad sweeping statements, and those piles of books there have lots of statistics in, but if I can just make some broad sweeping statements, that in terms of heterogeneity, South Africa ranks about 20th from the end of the world countries. In other words, there are somewhat like about 20 countries that are more heterogeneous than South Africa, if that's the right way to say it. So that's not an excuse for our problems, and I'm going to say a lot about Switzerland, which is conspicuously heterogeneous, and it is the country that I think has been the most successful under the most objectively adverse conditions. I did make a perhaps somewhat controversial statement that the concept of political separation of racial, ethnic, cultural, linguistic, or other groups is of itself not offensive. In other words, apartheid, to use the word itself, of itself would probably not have been offensive if done in a different way. I think it's too late now to put it right, but certainly all over the world there's been a history of sympathy for cultural, linguistic, ethnic, religious groupings. In fact, that is how Europe has been divided up. It is how the provinces of Canada are divided up. It is how India, Bangladesh, Pakistan are divided up. In the modern world, though, perhaps because of South Africa, the idea of ethnic autonomy has become unacceptable in world opinion, so that today we find the Northern Irish, or the Basques, or the Tamils, or the Scottish separatists, or the French in Quebec, or all of these groups that want ethnic separation politically are now being denied it, despite what might have been a perfectly non-offensive, legitimate political development. Even in Switzerland, you have had the ethnicity fairly rigid in some cases of the French, German, Italian, Romanish cantons, and they have, right into the last decade, had the ability to subdivide the cantons or shift the boundaries or create new cantons, and still continues in law. And no doubt at some future date, perhaps in the next decade or so, some new Swiss canton will come about. They've increased from something like 18 to 25 during this century. So what we have then, I also put in South Africa, and I'm going to elaborate on that now, is one of the most centralized systems in the world. Now, this is in spite of the fact that the government has been talking all along, and governments, plural, in the past in South African history have spoken all along of own identity, autonomy, self-government, etc. for different groupings. And that, if anything, is what South Africa has been criticized for internally and internationally. But the strange thing about this is that South Africa is more centralized, perhaps, than any other country almost in the world, but certainly in the Western world. Take the USA, which has 50 states, each with its own Congress, each with its own constitution, each with very considerable local diversity. For example, places like Texas, for all practical purposes, are tax havens. You have states with religious education in schooling. You have states where liquor isn't allowed. You have states where gambling isn't allowed. Enormous local diversity, enormous local control over own affairs. Education is a local government matter. Policing are local government affairs. And it's people in that country who are now demanding and protesting that South Africa become a unitary one-man, one-vote state. whereas they themselves would never tolerate it. I mean, there is no way I think anybody could persuade the American states to become a unitary state, to give up their own governors, their own governments, etc. The same is true of Canada, a federation of 6 or is it 7 states, I forget. The same is true of Australia. The same is true of the French provinces. The same is true even in the Eastern Bloc of the Soviets in the USSR, or the provinces of China, the provinces of India. High degrees of local independence and autonomy. In fact, it turns out on my research that about the only countries in the world which are anything like as centralized as South Africa are the very, very small countries. The average Scandinavian country, for example, is about the population size of the PWV, around 5.5, 6 million, and they are unitary states. Even in the Scandinavian countries, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, and Finland, you have total homogeneity. In fact, those countries rank in the homogeneity listings of the world as the only ones with 100% homogeneity. So only in small, geographically and population-wise countries, 100% homogeneous, do you actually find functioning unitary states in anything that resembles a democracy. And the irony is that the Western democracies, with some guys, some sort of mistaken view of what constitutes democracy, demand of South Africa that it become something which they themselves would never condone. Now, what I want to do is to use and propose for South Africa the Swiss model. And I'm going to say a sweeping statement in advance that if no Switzerland existed and a correct solution was found for South Africa's so-called problem, you could not have done much better than the Swiss constitution or the Swiss system. It's almost as if by some kind of miraculous fate, the Swiss system is precisely, you can almost take over verbatim its constitution, transplant it into South Africa, and have what seems to me, and to everyone to whom I've presented this, a sort of self-evident solution. And I'm going to use my sort of peculiar mind mapping method of presentation to present to you something of Switzerland. I have Switzerland in black and other in red going up here, just to give you some idea of the background of Switzerland. Switzerland is 40,000 square kilometers. Transkei is 43,000. So it's about the size of the Transkei. Its population is 6.5 million. The PWV population is 5.2 million. In other words, it's roughly the same size in population as the PWV. There are 25 cantons in Switzerland. The average population per canton, therefore, is around 260,000 per canton. That's just over 250,000 people per canton on average. Cape Town, for example, is 300,000 people. The PWV, as I said, is 5.2 million people. And cities typically in South Africa, the average city in South Africa, if you include the black area, the black township, are typically around 200,000 to 300,000. East London, Port Elizabeth, Durban. They're actually very big differences in population size, but they're somewhere between, say, 100 and 400,000, which is Durban. Kimberley, East London, Bloemfontein, Port Elizabeth, Durban, and so on. In South Africa, if we divided South Africa's population into the magisterial districts, of which there are just over 300, we would have an average population of 80,000 per magisterial district. Now, I'm going to propose that the simple thing to do in South Africa is to divide South Africa into cantons corresponding roughly to magisterial districts. I'm going to propose that some of those magisterial districts lend themselves automatically to consolidation. For example, in a place like Venda, you will have 4 or 5 magisterial districts. there seems to be little case for maintaining these very tiny ones, although there might well be local, tribal, geographic, developmental or other reasons for doing so. I'll come back to how one decides in the future. Just looking at the Swiss cantons, as I said, there are 25 cantons. To give you an example of how this can work. Now, this is not unique to Switzerland. I'm using Switzerland just as a demonstration, but let me remind you that the world has something like 50 countries of less than 100 square miles. Tiny little countries all over the world. Malta with a population of smaller than Cape Town. 2 little islands is an independent country, member of the United Nations, and many others. Many small countries, but Switzerland is the most relevant to the South African situation as I see it. The smallest canton in Switzerland is 14 square miles. That is Basel-Land. The smallest population in a canton, that's not the same canton, this is an Alpenzeel or something, a little mountain canton, 13,000 people. Now that's the size of a little Free State town. So now 13,000 people in Switzerland have their own parliament, their own constitution, their own political parties, their own political system, their own taxes, their own education policy, their own transport policy, their own housing policy, their own welfare policy, everything is run by those 13,000 people, to give an example of how far effectively one can decentralize. 8 of the cantons have less than 1,000 square miles and 9 have less than 50,000 population. Each has their own parliament and parties. There are 6 departments at the federal government, central government departments, and the taxes, etc. The only thing the central, virtually, so duties that's supposed to be, the only contact which Swiss citizens have with their central government virtually is that there are excise duties and sales taxes. And even the excise duty, of course, there's no direct contact with government. For all practical purposes, a Swiss citizen has next to nothing to do with the Swiss government. Their relationship, their political action is with their local government. And there's some quaint stories here. For example, the story about the Swiss German and the German. I told this before, but not all of you were present. To show you something about how democratic Switzerland is and how it works. The German said that the trouble with democracy is we vote too often. The Swiss fellow said, how often do you vote in Germany? And he said, well, we in Germany, we vote every 5 years, and that's far too frequently because the government doesn't have enough time to get its policies working, and there's another election and it loses and the next one comes in. So the Swiss fellow says, that's amazing you call that too often, because in my canton we vote every week. And the German said, well, that's because you always vote no, which is actually also true, because what they vote on in Switzerland is not parties and people, but policies. In other words, if the taxes are to be increased, if seatbelts are to be introduced, if the water is to be fluoridated, if the cinemas are to be segregated, if smoking is to be banned on the beaches, or whatever is going to happen, there's a referendum. The people are asked. So, as a result, the people feel as if they are actually deciding. They also feel as if their will is not being imposed upon by people elsewhere. And to show you what the risk of that is, which is important for South Africa, 65% of the Swiss are German-speaking, just under 18%, 20% are French, and 12% Italian, 1% Romansh, and 5% Gastarbeiters, migrant workers, Turks mainly, and others. Now, the majority are Germans, and the Germans and the French in Switzerland notoriously hate each other. They don't belong to the same clubs, they won't live in the same cities, or very seldom do. They have his own cantons, they're very, very, very ethnic in Switzerland. For what it's worth, the Swiss also have some other quaint things about them that are similar to South Africa in terms of the vote. Only in 1970 or 71 did Swiss women get the vote, and in some of the cantons they still don't have the vote. Now the interesting thing is Swiss women are notoriously liberated, They're just at least as liberated as women elsewhere in the world. And there was no evidence that Swiss women particularly cared about the vote. They didn't really agitate. There wasn't really much pressure. People just thought, well, you know, in the world most women have the vote. Why not let them have the vote here? And why did people not mind the denial of the vote to the majority of the population, who happen to be women? The minority are men. Well, because the government just wasn't very, very important in their lives. The same is true of Hong Kong, where the Chinese don't have the vote, but the English do. The English are about 5 to 10% of the Hong Kong population. They vote for Britain, which is the colonizing power. The Chinese don't. And you've never heard of Chinese people wanting the vote in Hong Kong. They don't have it in China, so maybe in Hong Kong they don't think they should have it either. But anyhow, the risk of domination by the Germans and the French, who don't like each other, is obviously considerable in Switzerland, and it's for this reason that the Swiss constitution was very carefully worked out so as to avoid the risk of group domination. And it's worked for 300 years. I'm not suggesting the Swiss constitution is 300 years old. The beginnings of Switzerland were 300 years ago, but it's been a growth experience. It's expanded and changed, and that's the other very exciting thing about Switzerland. It's organic. If people feel in a particular canton that they're running the risk of domination or swamping or whatever, they can start a lobby for the subdivision of the canton. Or if two cantons find that they're really what they call half cantons, they're really functioning as one town or one community or whatever, they start a lobby for the fusion of the cantons. Or if people feel that there's a community, a farming community or whatever, through which a cantonal boundary goes, they lobby for the shifting of the boundary. And there's a procedure under the Constitution for the cantons to be constantly changed to conform to what makes sense on the ground. This again seems to me to be, could not be more suitable for Switzerland than it is for South Africa. South Africa surely has a case for, if you like, a fixed constitution under which there is room for constant organic growth, change according to whether local conflicts emerge or don't emerge, whether differences emerge in terms of welfare policy, housing policy, group differences emerge. I was being told today at lunch, for example, which you might know about, something that few people outside of the Indian community know about, the degree of difference there is between Hindus and Muslims, for example. Now you might find that in a place like Lenasia there will be a lobby on for Lenasia to be split into two half cantons or whatever, who knows. But the point is that this is accommodated as an ongoing fact of Swiss life, which is unique as far as I know about the Swiss constitution, and seems to me is something that is absolutely tailor-made for South Africa's conditions. Going from that, then let me get on to South Africa and how I see the South African constitution. I would propose that South Africa be divided into something like 200 cantons, which would give it an average canton size of something like 120,000 people per canton. I would propose that they be called cantons. It doesn't matter what one calls them. I think if one calls them states, or if you call the idea of federation, you're faced with a problem that in most people's minds and in most political science literature, that means something on the magnitude, say, of Canada, Australia, or America, where the component states are very large, millions of people, millions of square miles, and where the degree of centralization is greater than in the Swiss Federation. I believe that the degree of centralization envisaged at the beginning of America was probably adequate, but that has been systematically eroded by court interpretations of the Constitution and by amendments to the Constitution. As I've said, the boundaries of the cantons, and they should correspond, as I said, to the magisterial districts. The logic to that in South Africa is the magisterial districts already have existing administrative infrastructure. They are non-ideological boundaries, they are logical boundaries. They're boundaries that are made because of the sensibility of having those as tax units, as judicial units, administrative units for things like regional offices, population registration, and so on. Although they are non-ideologic, they are in part ethnic. In other words, it is true, for example, that Soweto is one magisterial district and Johannesburg another, so that by the nature of South Africa's demography, the magisterial districts do represent some kind of ethnic pattern, but not always. There are magisterial districts, obviously, especially in the rural areas, that cover whole towns, and in most magisterial districts, let me immediately say, with very, very few exceptions, the majority of people are black. So even magisterial district division does not create what most conservative whites would want, and that is a numerical majority. And I'm going to try to persuade you that a numerical majority in a canton, even with universal suffrage, is not a necessary condition for the preservation of white rights or minority rights or individual rights or Western culture or religion or whatever it is that one is concerned about losing in the fray. Each canton or magisterial district could have its own constitution. That should be determined by referendum. In other words, there will be political groupings forming. They will propose their constitutions. For example, the ANC could propose the Freedom Charter approach in Soweto or wherever it thinks it's going to get a majority. The Progs could propose some kind of social democracy in Houghton or northern Johannesburg or wherever, and you could have the Sabra movement. Those who want a white homeland or homelands would be free to propose ethnic constitutions, or at least constitutions in which ethnic separation or discrimination is permitted, perhaps entrenched. That is to say, the right to discriminate, that people may have separate pools, clubs, schools, whatever, cinemas, if they like. In other words, the full kaleidoscope of opinion and ideology can be accommodated, and will in fact be accommodated, as it is in not only Switzerland but even the states of America, and for that matter the states of Canada. I would propose that this division be entirely depoliticized, that a Judicial Delimitation Commission be established, and this is in preference to some kind of national convention. I'm going to say why I believe a national convention as proposed by the Progressive Party is unrealistic and wrong, and that instead you leave this entirely Judicial Delimitation Commission, which can take evidence on whatever anyone chooses to leave, including ethnic factors. In other words, people opposed to ethnic delimitations can come and argue their case. Say, for example, the whole PWV should be one canton or one state or whatever, that all the magisterial districts in it should be combined. Or alternatively, you could come and argue for ethnically divided cantons, like I said, Hindus and Muslims if they want to, or whites and blacks obviously, or browns or Indians or whatever. But I think that what the Judicial Delimitation Commission will be charged with under this constitution is a rebuttable presumption in favor of magisterial districts. In other words, people will have to give evidence as to why a magisterial district should not be an autonomous unit. They would have to dissuade the Judicial Commission from the magisterial district. There would be a common citizenship, and essential to this would be free movement of people across the boundaries of these cantons, as there is in Switzerland, because the vote by the feet is more powerful ultimately than the vote by the ballot paper. Voting with feet is much more effective in Switzerland at keeping the cantons behaving themselves than the ballot box. And because as soon as one canton starts doing silly things, people just simply vote with their feet for another canton that doesn't do silly things. For example, Basel-Stadt, which is one half of Basel, increased taxes, Basel-Land reduced taxes, and hocus pocus, people moved from Basel-Stadt to Basel-Land. Basel-Land had high growth, Basel-Stadt had low growth, Basel-Stadt went backwards and Basel-Stadt went forwards. and continues to do so, so Basel-Stadt then has to start behaving itself. This seems to me to be by far the best protection for any group in South Africa in the long run. In the short run, one can have all kinds of other attempts to solve the problem, which I don't think anybody can predict will end conflict. I don't think there's anybody who seriously could predict that with a centralized system in South Africa, whoever is in power, the PROGs, the NATS, the CP, HNP, left, right, OZAPO, UDF, so long as the system is centralized, I would argue that it is impossible to solve the problem. Only if it is decentralized could it be solved, and then a number of solutions are feasible. So that the real protection you have is that if a ZAPO gets in the Soweto area and the NATS get in Pretoria and the PROGs in Johannesburg, for example, then you would, let us assume that Johannesburg adopts more pro-growth, more pro-freedom policies more preferred by most people. What you would predict is that investment would leave Soweto and come to Johannesburg. Now in Switzerland, what is very exciting is that there are some cantons, especially the Italian cantons in Switzerland, who have socialist governments, radical left-wing governments. And those radical left-wing governments maintain the freest economy in Europe, which is Switzerland, the freest economy in the West. Why? Because it works. As soon as they try to increase taxes excessively or expand welfare statism or kill the goose that lays the egg, their canton starts declining. Now this demonstration effect is apparent throughout the world. Anywhere in the world you can see that countries that adopt certain policies prosper and countries that don't lag. And there's almost a direct correlation that overrides all other considerations between countries that adopt essentially free market or individualist or classical liberal policies or libertarian or whatever you want to call them. Those countries are prosperous, stable, peaceful. And countries to the degree that they do not adopt those policies almost directly are underdeveloped, backward, unstable, conflict-ridden. And the most impressive recent evidence of that was the World Bank study on interest on tax rates, and they had some kind of index of intervention, and they showed this precise correlation: low tax, low intervention produced high growth almost precisely throughout the world. This was a World Bank study. There's no reason to believe the people behind it had any bias, but it was regardless of the size of the country, of its history, of its stage of development, of its ethnicity, of its race, of its natural resource endowment, of when it started industrializing. It overrode all other considerations. Low tax, low intervention produced high growth. Now maybe high growth isn't all you want, but it turns out that high growth comes along with high life expectancy, low infant mortality rates, low divorce rates, low social problem rates like crimes of violence and so on. Also there is a looser but nonetheless still a correlation between countries with high growth and low social problem rates or criminal action rates or whatever. Those figures I will, when I put this into print, produce the sources and the figures. I know most of them fairly roughly off the top of my head, so if anyone wants detail, I can substantiate most of them. The freest economy in the developed world today happens to be Japan, and Japan is also the lowest tax economy apart from Switzerland in the developed world, and Japan has, for example, the highest life expectancy, which is likely in a few years' time to be 80 years. It has the highest education level, lowest infant mortality, lowest crime of violence, and so on. So Japan is a perfect model of this correlation. It does have a higher suicide rate than a number of other countries. I'm not quite sure why, but when you bear in mind that the number of people who commit suicide are so infinitesimal it's hardly important what the country's suicide rate is. So these cantons or states or divisions or provinces or whatever one calls them would have local autonomy, and they would have autonomy over anything over which they want autonomy. That is why they established their own constitution. In Switzerland, this is how it is. For example, in Switzerland, if the federal government wants to build a railway line across the country, and it is in charge of major infrastructure, it has to do a deal with every single canton along the way. Now that sounds like a lot of negotiation, but of course it's a fraction of the negotiation that takes place to build a railway line. I mean, the work that you require to build a railway line, that's a trivial part of the total job. But nonetheless, the cantons usually obviously behave sensibly, but there was recently a case where 2 cantons did not want a major freeway going through them. And they did simply not allow it, and the federal government had to go via another route, through other cantons. And that is the kind of autonomy which you take unto yourself as a unit. Now you might say to me, what happens if they want to simply secede and establish their own defense force and their own citizenship and become a totally independent state? It is argued by some political scientists, incidentally, that Switzerland is not a country, but 25 countries that have formed a mutual defense agreement and a customs union. That may be true. The degree at which one is or isn't a unitary state, in some sense the EEC is almost as much a state as Switzerland is a state. But with NATO as its defense force, if you like, and with the customs union under the EEC. But whatever you call it, it's a matter of degree, and I don't think it's very important. I think the point is, more devolution is better than less devolution. Now, and if a state wants to take autonomy, this is where I come out, where I have great difficulty in South Africa, is when I say to people that I am opposed, strongly opposed, emotionally opposed to apartheid, discriminatory laws. I am equally strongly in favor of the Homeland policy. Now we have this, that might come as a surprise to you, but most people assume that the Homeland policy and apartheid are the same thing. They are not. There is no reason why you cannot have, indeed you should have a Homeland policy without apartheid. The Homeland policy should be entirely voluntary, absolute free choice as to who goes there or leaves there. As to whether or not it becomes independent should be determined by referendum, and its degree of independence should be determined by referendum. And the unit which can make a claim to becoming an independent state or homeland or whatever you like to call it will make its case to a judicial commission, not to politicians. And in my scheme of things, it is quite conceivable or likely, even one might say, that the current homelands or national states are mostly fairly sensible units. Not always. For example, Ciskei, I don't think is a sensible unit. I think the border region is a sensible unit. So the Ciskei would be expanded to make a geographic or economic unit, or maybe divided into a different kind of unit. The boundaries now do not make much sense, other than that in 1913 the British government decided that that should be a native reserve for the Pedis and the Fingos and a few others. But it doesn't have much logic, the present boundaries, but that in that place there's a sensible unit does make sense. And if one can rid oneself of the emotion that South African politics generates, I think that people should be able to see that. And for example, Natal, KwaZulu does not make much sense. I don't think it can make much sense to anybody if you look at it on a map. And so what do you have? Do you have the whole of KwaZulu-Natal being one state? Or is it 3 or 4 states? But I think those facts there, for example, is something not as obvious as, say, Transkei or Ciskei or Leboa. Bophuthatswana is not obvious. There's no earthly reason on the map or in logic that I can see as to why Tabanshu should be part of Bophuthatswana. Little place tucked away in the Free State over there, doesn't make much sense to anybody, it seems to me. So in the whole South African political thing, unfortunately, the concept of homelands or independent states has been given such terrible emotional content that it is almost impossible for me to even suggest to somebody that apartheid is wrong and homelands are right. But nobody's been able to tell me what's wrong with that proposition. It's simply a knee-jerk presumption that they are two sides of the same thing. There is no logic in that presumption whatsoever, and it is quite feasible to conceive of a homeland policy as you can with Ireland, for example. Ireland, by the way, is very small too. The Irish population, I have the figure, I forget it. Does anyone know? It's anyway, Ireland would... Sorry?
Something like 3.5 million.
Is it that much? I thought it was even less. But anyway, 3.5 million at its size is very, very small. But Ireland too would be an example of a place smaller than a canton. Anyway, in these cantons, they would each have their own assembly, their own parties. There could be parties that transcend the canton boundaries. They would control their own transport policy. You would not have to have transport boards. You would not have a national policy like the Welgemoed Commission that decides whether pirate taxis are good or bad. You would not have PUTCO buses imposed by the central government. If somebody wants to give PUTCO a monopoly, let them do it. But the chances are you will see by demonstration from those who don't do it that it's not a good idea to create transport monopolies. That is my prediction, and if I'm wrong, let's see. The nice thing about the canton approach is that there is permanent competition amongst different policies, a permanent demonstration effect, as economists call it. You can see constantly from day to day which tax policy, which subsidy policy, which transport policy, which housing policy, which race policy is the one most conducive to the social objectives that one is pursuing. They would each have their own housing policy. Why must people living in the Winterveld have the same building standards imposed on them as the people living in Houghton? It is absurd. I cannot conceive of anybody who thinks that that is a sensible thing to have in a country. Or a policy that says meat slaughtered in Thornhill in the Ciskei, where people have a per capita income of 100 rand per annum, has to be slaughtered in a first world. How much does an abattoir cost, Simon, that complies with international health standards? 3 million?
Cost 50, the big ones, Cato region CDD cost about 50 million. About
50 million, okay.
That was 8-10 years ago.
Okay, but say, I mean, if you built a really small one, you could get away for 3 million, maybe.
10 million.
10 million, okay, 10 million. Whereas in fact what the people do is slaughter the thing at a slaughter pole out on the rock, perfectly hygienic. Now to suggest that there is one set of standards, for example, if you take electrification standards, South Africa has the highest and most costly electricity standards in the world, almost, and I know that Mr. Adams disagrees with me on this, but I think that I stand by my case, that these are absolutely absurd to apply these standards in a third world developing context. I think it's absurd to apply them in the CBD of Johannesburg, but it's even more absurd to apply them in the Winterveld. And so it goes with building standards, double layer brick walls, etc. But let each place decide for itself. We have in the Transvaal the most onerous township development ordinance. Maybe the Cape is more onerous, but the effect is that it takes from 4 to 10 or 15 or actually infinite number of years to establish a township, whereas in Britain, say, it can take as little as 6 months. In socialist Britain, which we keep pointing a finger at, under the Labour government, which we kept accusing of being... I mean, it was interesting to me when Britain, when Harold Wilson was in power, the South Africans loved chopping Britain for being so socialist. And what was Britain doing? It was nationalising the railways. In other words, it was becoming like South Africa. It was nationalising housing like South Africa. It was nationalising telephones, nationalising steel industry, nationalising the coal mines. And in other words, the more Britain became like South Africa, the more we pointed a finger at it and said, you dirty socialists. But anyway, we don't need to have one policy, and it is self-evidently wrong to have one policy, I would argue. There are few countries in the world that have one policy on housing or any of these issues. Very, very few. Our housing policy, for example, for the protection of brick or what's it, Coro brick, and I can think of no other reason why we have this housing policy, says we have to use bricks to build houses. I can't imagine any other reason than to protect Coro brick. Please, if there's any press, don't quote me on that. But in the most sophisticated countries, in Beverly Hills, in New York, in Los Angeles, you can live in a wood frame house, which is supposed to be inferior in South Africa. The Scandinavian countries, you live in wooden houses, prefab houses, concrete slab houses, any jolly old house you like. Can be caravan houses, mobile homes, are permitted all over the world in the most sophisticated, wealthy countries of the world, but not in South Africa, where we have one set of building standards. And that set of building standards doesn't make sense anywhere, but assuming it does, it certainly doesn't make sense in Soweto, where, let me remind you that in order to sell the houses under the government's privatization program, the minute one of those houses in Soweto is sold, it becomes automatically a condemned slum under the Slums Act. It is actually illegal for anyone to own a home of the standard by which 500,000 homes have been built by the government in South Africa. They are all illegal. So what happens is, of course, the government exempts itself from its own laws, builds slums by the 100,000, forbids the private sector from building slums, and then we wonder why there's a housing shortage. Now, whatever government supply anywhere in the world, there's a shortage of. Always. It's a sort of Louw's law of government, is that governments produce shortages. Whether it's telephones or trains or buses or houses or education or whatever, it's always in short supply. And wherever those self-same things are provided, and in the Eastern Bloc, of course, if it's candy bars or movie tickets or football matches or TV shows or whatever is produced in the Eastern Bloc, clothing is in short supply if it's done by the government. No matter what the government does, it always does in short supply. That is a sort of inherent law of nature, sort of like the law of gravity. And it's not just because I don't like government intervention. It's like if somebody jumps off a cliff and an engineer stands there with his calculator and says he'll accelerate to the ground at 32 feet per second squared, and since he's jumped off a 200-foot cliff, he'll turn into a pancake. Then you could say, oh, this engineer is a terrible person. He lacks compassion for cliff jumpers. How can he say such horrible things? Why is he so why is he so crude or whatever? Well, the fact is you can predict that certain actions lead to certain consequences. And one of them is that government provision of housing, like jumping off a cliff, leads to pancakes. Government provision of housing leads to shortages. Price control leads to shortages. Subsidies lead to surpluses. Government regulation leads to conflict and politicization. Those are inevitable as night follows day. Then they would have control over their own social affairs, and whether they can have discriminatory laws or not, I think the chances are that in the early stages it would be unrealistic to expect a widespread acceptance of this approach without allowing some of them to maintain statutory discrimination. I would argue that you do need a Bill of Rights in which voluntary discrimination is entrenched as a human right. In other words, affirmative action would actually be illegal in my scheme of things, and should be illegal in any liberal country of the world. The reason for that is that under affirmative action, where you force people to integrate against their will, that seems to me to be even worse than forcing people to segregate against their will. For example, in the USA, under so-called enlightened human rights laws, children are forced, because they are of their skin color, to be bused for 2, 3, 4 hours each way to school and back, and forced by virtue of skin color to receive inappropriate or inferior education, and forced solely on account of skin color to sit next to other people next to whom they might not want to sit. That seems to me to be diabolical and offensive to any notion of justice, fairness, or liberty. In South Africa, children are forced solely on account of skin color not to sit next to each other at school, even if they want to. They are forced to sit apart and go to different schools. They may not be bused if they want to schools where they can get an inferior or inappropriate education, and so on. It seems to me that this is a crazy sort of world, Alice in Wonderland world, in which two forms of apartheid are practiced, one in the USA and Britain, one in South Africa. The one in South Africa is currently out of vogue, and the one in the USA is currently in vogue. I would suggest that we don't tolerate either form of statutory discrimination, and we let people decide for themselves. If my brother, for example, feels very strongly that he doesn't want his children to go to school with people of another color, well, I just think, well, so be it. I don't see on what account someone of another color would want to go to school with children like that. Anyway, it seems to me that everyone is accommodated if you simply just allow people who want to segregate, and people who want to integrate. I cannot see who the losers are in the scheme of things, but I can see who the losers are where you have enforced segregation and where you have enforced integration. People would control everything, the labour, all matters, except the central government, as in Switzerland, would have limited power. It will not be able to make laws other than those which are endowed to it, which I'll come to in red. There would be a Bill of Rights that overrides, I think, all of the states. There would be certain things which no canton may do. For example, no component state may impose compulsory discrimination or compulsory integration. Sorry.
Can I just suggest that you call it Bill of Right? Right is a much better semantic word than rights. I think it helps. It's a change. It's not really rights.
Now, there's an enormous debate amongst political scientists as to whether one has human right or human rights, and I'm aware of that. But in fact, only amongst the very few political scientists who participate in that debate is the distinction clear or significant. I'm not sure if it's worth it for me to try and persuade the general public that the philosophers have a legitimate thing. But I take your point, and if one uses the right terminology, that is the correct terminology. Talk of human right, not rights. That is the correct terminology. It may just be a little obscure for lay people, but that is quite so. I would say that the central government would have an appeal court, an independent judiciary, from which people at canton courts can appeal. This would avoid, as it always does in devoluted societies, local domination for ethnic or cultural or whatever, or some local corrupt purpose. I mean, often it's just things like the hillbillies in Kentucky who don't like people with long hair, so they sentence them to death or whatever because they happen to be in the jury. So you do want to have an ability to take the jurisdiction out of the local community where you expect some kind of objective trial or justice to take place. The appeal court would, as does the Privy Council in the Commonwealth, apply the law of the canton from which the case comes, not the federal law. There would not be a federal law. In other words, the appeal court, as it does in South Africa now, our appeal court in Bloemfontein has to try cases in which the law of, for example, Natal, Cape Town, or Cape Transvaal, Free State, all of which have differences in their law. And now, of course, in addition, the independent states have appeal rights to the appeal court, and they have different laws. So it's quite a common thing for a central appeal court to try under different legal systems. It's quite normal. That's what the Supreme Court in the USA does. It was the Federal Appeal Court does in Switzerland and so on. There would be 5 departments in my scheme of things. The federal government, the central government, whatever you want to call it, would have only defense, major infrastructure, foreign affairs, finance, and I call it, for lack of a better name, population registration. The technical term would normally be something like internal affairs. That's births, marriages, deaths, and voting rights and so on. That could be quite conceivably local, but there might be economies of scale in doing it centrally. Now, what then I want to come round to is the very crisp issue of the race conflict in South Africa. What I think emerges by any objective analysis of the South African situation, and any objective analysis is one that coincides with my analysis. You must appreciate that. Any objective analysis has to lead you to conclude that South Africa will continue to have escalating conflict, violence, unrest, low growth. We are now averaging around 2%, or if that growth. Is that correct, Martin? I'm not sure, but anyway, for the last 3-5 years, we've been one of the basket countries of the world, one of the low-growth countries. We are now being outstripped by many African countries north of us, which is something for which we should bow our heads in shame, considering that they are really hardly models of good government. What I do want to say, though, is that the case for limiting the power of government and the case for limiting the functions of government is not only, as you all know, I have argued at great length, a case based on economics. That the economics of interventionism, although a number of economists still stick to it, partly because it creates jobs for economists, is really dead. There are increasingly few economists in the world, academic economists, who will continue to defend central planning, Keynesianism, Galbraithianism, socialism, Marxism, in one of Marxism's 50 or so forms. There are very few economists to be found today who are not in one of the essentially free market schools of thought, whether it's Georgism, as Godfrey is, or whether it's supply side or monetarism or Austrianism or Manchester School or Freiburg School or a public choice school or whatever it is. Basically, that is now where something like 80 to 90% of all economists find themselves. So the case for free or relatively free markets is an open and shut case. It really does not need to be debated anymore. All the empirical evidence that comes out from wherever it comes supports that case. The Eastern Bloc countries themselves have recognized this, and they are now rapidly privatizing and deregulating. Even the countries in the West with nominally socialist governments, Italy, France, Malta, and others, are now deregulating and privatizing on a grand scale. Italy is privatizing its telephone service. It has a Small Business Deregulation Act, and so on. In China, they have free enterprise zones. They have deregulation and privatization of everything you can think of, including farming. But the real case, the better case, I think, for limiting the functions and powers of government than its economic merit or its economic case is its political case. That if government has lots of power, the society has to be conflict-ridden. Now, let me test that with you and ask you, where have we seen unrest in South Africa? It has been the Sharpeville riots, influx control, passes. What is that? It is a curtailment of the ability of employers to recruit labor wherever they like, and the ability of workers to sell labor wherever they like. It's a market intervention. It's not a racial intervention. Influx control is not a racial intervention. Now that might come as a shock to you or a surprise to you, but in law, influx control stops blacks going from one black area to another black area. Group area laws stop blacks going from black areas to white areas. Influx control stops a black person from going from Ga-Rankuwa to Soweto or to Duncan Village or whatever. It stops blacks moving as between black areas. So influx control was an economic measure that incidentally seems to have held no potential economic benefits for whites, probably no potential political benefits for whites, but a great deal of benefits for urbanized blacks. It's a way to give a monopoly on the labor market in areas of low unemployment and high wage labor demand to blacks who happen already to be there. For example, to limit the number of blacks who may go into Soweto, what you do is you say, Soweto blacks are going to be protected from an increase in the supply of labour. That's more labour competition, that means lower wages. Who pays those higher wages is, of course, white employers largely and white consumers largely, although black consumers are obviously a growing share of the market. Whites are penalised by influx control. They're penalised not only in the sense that there is less labour in the white areas or in the dormitory towns around the white areas, it's more expensive labour, more expensive goods, higher cost method of production, but they're also penalised because they now have to pay for the decentralisation policy to establish jobs for blacks where they are being kept by the policy. Anyway, Sharpeville was influx control, a labour market control. I do not regard influx control as a political control, although that is how most people see it. But I don't think it can really be argued that that's what it is in essence. Housing. When the rents rise, you have rent boycotts, rioting, as in Sebokeng and the Vaal Triangle. Transport. When the bus fares rise, the burning of buses, the bus boycott, the stoning of buses in Mdansani and elsewhere. Education. When the government makes the use of Afrikaans in black schools mandatory, what do you get? You have the Soweto riots. Every single major wave of unrest is directly attributable to a form of government control which need not have taken place even within the objectives and framework of apartheid. Those were not in any sense a part of the race policy. They were unnecessary direct government economic interventions. So that government control causes unavoidably political conflict. If power is decentralized, you might get away with control without conflict. But the chances are then your decentralized unit will retrogress economically and it won't work. So it seems to me that the political problem's only potential solution is devolute government power, deregulate the economy, which entails decriminalize the economy, depoliticize society, leave social, racial and ethnic decisions to the people, not to law. And this seems to me to be the only potential solution. It seems to me to be Hobson's choice. I don't really think there is another option. And I don't know of anyone else who has suggested an option. And let me close by also reminding you that, those of you that were here, that last time I pointed out that all the political groupings from far right to far left in South Africa are characterized by the position they take as regards what they oppose. They oppose domination, or they oppose white rule, or they oppose a unitary state, or whatever. None of the groupings have a prescription for what they are in favor of, from left to right. And it seems to me there's a void to be filled, and the reason it has not been filled is because people have worked within this false assumption that the solution must be found within a framework of a high degree of centralization. And in that assumption, it cannot be solved. And that is what I think has got to be added into the debate. And I don't mean watered down federalism of the kind that is proposed by some of the parties. That is not devolution, really. To give an example, when Mike Rosholt and Tony Bloom returned, Gavin Reilly and Tony Bloom returned from meeting with Oliver Tambo and the ANC, they said they could not agree on an economic policy. My question is, why were they trying to agree on an economic policy? Seems to me that that is flawed even at square one, and they are known to be representatives of Progressive Party opinion. If they were representing any intelligible, hopeful solution, it would have been to say, let's not try to agree on an economic policy. We are not going to, and we cannot, and we need not. Let's rather agree on a political policy. That's my view on how to solve the problem, and it is the only way I believe that it can be solved. Thank you. Leon, I'd like to say I think that's the most sensible thing I've heard in a long time about how we could get a government in this country. But could you give your view on the status quo, the enormous power that the government holds at the moment, the importance that that has to the people in power, and the enormous attractiveness of gaining that power to the people who are trying to gain it at the moment, and how you overcome that as a problem?
Yes. I don't think that to the people in power, the power is as attractive as one might think. I think to the people in power, the National Party, it is now becoming a very, very embarrassing thing that they have so much centralized power. They are trying desperately to wriggle out of it. They are trying desperately to wriggle out of it, and the bureaucracy, which Martin Spring raised last time, is really the problem, not the politician, not the party. They're trying to wriggle out of it because I don't think anybody really believes you can hold on to it for indefinitely. Certainly you can't hold on to it and expect peace. You might hold on to it under conditions of considerable repression, but I don't think anybody believes you can hold on to it and have any kind of civilized order. I think I don't personally have a problem that some very different creative model is saleable. It is saleable, I think, not only to the National Party, but to all whites. All the white parties, I think, are grappling with the same thing. I don't think the progs really want to take over the status quo. In fact, the prog policy is that if they do, they're going to abdicate, which is called a national convention. I don't think the NRP really think they want to take it over either. So I think all the white groupings at the moment, I mean the CP and the HNP, might think they want to take it over, but really what will they do if they take it over? What will the CP do if Treurnig comes in? Is he really going to be able to reverse the tide? Does he think he can? I doubt it. I think it's very easy to make political hot air at the moment and sling mud at each other amongst the white groupings, but I have very serious doubts as to if any of them really want to govern at the moment. It is something that is an embarrassment, I think. So that it's saleable, it seems to me, to all the white groupings to say, look, the one way you, the Nats, can keep power is to try to keep it in Nat strongholds forever. I don't think any Nats really think they can hold on to national party, well, they've already lost a lot of it, but national party control of Southern Africa is something which very, very few nationalists think is here to stay for much longer. And it's declared government policy that it's not here to stay. Quite how they're going to untie it is something that there is not yet a prescription for, but it is not the government's policy to even try to do so. So that it is saleable to, it seems to me, the government, that this is a means whereby they will be able to maintain certain pockets of influence and strongholds, maybe quite major ones. It's saleable also to the other white parties, because the other white parties I don't think really think they're ever going to get into power. I mean, you must be very demotivated if you've been a prog all these years, as I think you happen to be, that you've been fighting and fighting and fighting, and now as you get to where the party's the official opposition, it seems as if the whole system is coming to an end anyway. So it must be very, very frustrating and demotivating. So none of the white parties think they're going to come to power, at least not in the present scheme of things. So surely what this does say to every single white grouping who currently run the country is here you have a chance for your group to effectively govern in your areas of influence. And that is more than what they have, I think. I think they are all net winners in the scheme of things. Now let's go to the groups that are out of power, the non-white groups, the not white groups. Because non-white, I've never found a suitable single word that doesn't have insulting connotations. But anyway, the not white groups, work through them from left to right. Does any one of them, I mean the UDF I said last time would probably win a majority of black votes. I was criticised by Eustace Davey, who made a legitimate criticism, and that is that when the chips are down, how are the votes really going to go amongst the blacks? And how many whites, for example, would vote for, say, Buthelezi, if you did have a universal suffrage? I mean, the current public opinion polls suggest a majority support for Mandela. But that's easy when the world of politics is not a reality. But if Mandela were released and Mandela were campaigning against Buthelezi and Motlana and Quebosa and Oliver Tambo, I mean, why would they get together with each other, Tambo and Mandela? And then there's a ZAPO and the Black Consciousness movement and so on. So it seems to me that none of those groupings can reasonably expect to seize power. What they might expect is some kind of coalition of the left, if you like. But the Black Consciousness, the ZAPO types, really see as the Marxist, if you like. Although I'm not sure why Marxists are in the Black Consciousness movement, because they're supposed to be solidarity of the working class. But nonetheless, that's where you tend to find the most radical Marxists. Now, those types really also, certainly in no opinion poll suggests they have a chance. They might in pockets, like Soweto, or like KwaMashu, or somewhere. So it seems to me that none of them can be sitting around wherever they're plotting the revolution tonight, thinking that in a democracy they are going to preside or win somehow. They might, the best hope they have is some kind of coalition. But the chances are they would be outnumbered by a coalition of moderates. It's a coalition of all the white groupings, the majority of Indians, Browns, and say the moderate blacks, Inkatha types, the followers of the current Homeland national state leaders and so on. So what they are offered is the same thing, is more than they have, more prospect than they have. Under such a scheme of things, they have a prospect of actually really governing in some area in some meaningful way, implementing their policies amongst their followers in a conflict-reduced, depoliticized way. So that it seems to me that all of the groupings have only gains. None of them have losses. The current bureaucracy, which Martin Spring raised, is indeed a vested interest. The political parties are not vested interests in the status quo. The political parties all have a vested interest in something like I propose. All of them, from far right to far left. The current bureaucracy has a vested interest in the status quo. And that is why they have consistently sabotaged every attempt by the politicians to bring about reform. If I can add, just, sorry, it's not a response to your question, but Ian and I were involved in the SWAT Commission report, the Ciskei reforms. And if Ciskei is regarded, for example, as a canton, it is significant that having been the most unpopular, most unstable, most politicized of all the areas of South Africa, with the most conflict, the Mdansani unrest and bus boycott 2 years ago, it is now one of the calmest and most prosperous parts of South Africa. There's a little spillover unrest in Mdansani and school boycotts, but basically there's been no boycotts, or very few. There's been very, very little unrest. All around, surrounded by the Eastern Cape turmoil, is an example of how with no political change, merely deregulation, the society can be, conflict can be eliminated or reduced. Graham?
Leon, a few areas that I thought perhaps attention could be focused on as well.
Excuse me, can you all hear at the back?
Sorry.
Perhaps you could sort of address yourself.
A second. Are you having her? Firstly, I thought that the presentation was excellent, and I've never heard such a lucid presentation of the solution to South Africa. But there's certain areas, like, for example, the composition of the central government, that needs attention, perhaps by proportional representation of the parties in each canton, or some other method of each canton being represented in proportion to their size, or maybe equally. I don't know. That's something we should talk about. Also, the checks and balances within the central government, because inevitably the central government will have, or maybe not, but will certainly have a black majority rule composed of various factions. But the way that central government itself can declare war, can impose foreign policies, can raise its tax revenue in some way, should be restricted by some. And also the other point I have a problem with is mobility. And I agree completely that there should be free mobility. That's the essence of your model. But what about mobility across foreign borders, firstly? And secondly, what about the situation regarding secession? That's where I do disagree with you. I think that states should not have the right to secede. I think they should have the right to have virtually full autonomy, but in some kind of overall federal structure where at least the minimal powers retained by central government are still imposed on these states. Because if states secede, you might find that the more liberally orientated, the more free market states all decide to secede, for example, which removes the freedom of choice of the people voting with their feet to go to a free market, because all of a sudden the borders become restricted again. Sorry, can I make one more point? And so that was central government. Okay. The last point, which I have difficulty in thinking clearly through, is what role central government would play in its Department of Finance. Just what kind of functions this department would have. Perhaps you could talk about that as well.
Yeah. The question of secession, I accept that case, because the fact that there are different countries in the world has meant that the desirable countries have closed their borders to immigration, and the undesirable countries have closed their borders to immigration. And again, there's a fairly precise correlation there between relatively free markets and relatively unfree markets. Unfree markets have to force the people to stay in, and free markets think they have to force the people to stay out. That is a problem, but the question I have is, if it is legitimate for example, Luxembourg or Liechtenstein to stop a massive influx of Italians and French and Belgians and Dutch and Spaniards and Czechoslovaks and so on, who all might want to flood into Luxembourg because it's got such a fantastic living standard, why is it not also legitimate for the Ciskei, which now has an influx problem? People are now flooding into the Ciskei. Now, I happen to think it's not legitimate. I think there should be free movement across international borders. And I think there are market constraints on the amount of influx into little old Luxembourg or Guernsey or Singapore, Hong Kong or whatever. I mean, Hong Kong tolerated from a population of 600,000 in about 1950 an increase within 2 decades of an addition of 4 million. What is that? That's 6-7 times 700% population growth in 2 decades or something. And Hong Kong still is the wonderful, prosperous, exciting place it is. There are a few transitional slums, people moving up and in, the boat people, freedom swimmers and so on, but nonetheless, the influx did not cause a problem. It's a mistaken view that influx is bad for the people to where you go. Every additional human being makes things better for other human beings, which is why we have migrant labor on our gold mines. It's better to have them than not to have them. And there's a great error in this whole migration issue. But what I would say is that if a case can be made for secession from a world government, which every single country constitutes, then is not the same case available to secession for one of our states or cantons? Why deny it the right to secede if Lesotho can be independent, or Swaziland, or Luxembourg, or Liechtenstein, or Gibraltar, or whatever? I don't see that. You know, in other words, I don't see why sauce for the goose should not be sauce for the gander. But if you want to argue with me about the right to migrate all over the world, yes, I agree. That's a different issue. Then on the question of central government being black, yes, it will be black, I predict, by any way you arrange this thing. But remember what it's going to be doing. It doesn't really matter what its color is, in the same way that in Switzerland it doesn't matter whether the Germans are the majority. Because if it's just running the defense force, well, you know, if you're white, you might think that the blacks run the defense force less efficiently. Or you might prefer to see these, I mean, for me, you'd like to see people like you, the Jews, running it. I mean, they seem to be very good at defense forces. The Israelis, you probably get some of the Israelis out here. But whoever, you see, infrastructure, well, you might make roads well or badly. Foreign affairs, well, they might be slow at issuing passports, or they might demand visas for your business visitors or whatever. Finance, well, they might not balance the budget or something like that. Registration, well, they might lose your birth certificate. But does it really matter? Is that really going to bother anybody? Which group runs those kinds of affairs? As it doesn't bother anybody in Switzerland, or it didn't used to bother people when the federal government of America stuck to those kinds of powers. But what I would also propose, and you're quite right to raise it, is that how does the federal government become the federal government? And this is very, very important the way it works in Switzerland. Is in Switzerland there is no direct vote for the federal government. And that is why you can't talk about whether Switzerland has a left-wing or right-wing government, or conservative or liberal. No one knows who the Swiss Prime Minister is. No one knows who the Minister of anything is. No one cares. The Swiss Prime Minister, if he's lucky, gets a bicycle for transport purposes. But the federal government of Switzerland is not voted for directly. There are no such things as Swiss elections. There are Swiss referendums, things that are subject to the control of the federal government, might well be the subject of a national referendum on a policy issue. But the federal government is constituted out of a formula in the Constitution, which is something like proportional representation, but which is loaded against the most numerous, the most populous cantons, so as to reduce the German dominance. So the Germans do not have effective control of the federal government, although they are the majority group. And in South Africa, the blacks are somewhat bigger than the Germans, but you could also have a similar formula whereby in the central government all the cantons would be represented, as they are in Switzerland, with a loading biased against the most populous. And that's how the Swiss thing works, and how I think it would work out. In other words, it wouldn't be entirely black, but the majority would be black. And that would not seem to me a problem. By the way, I don't see that there's much evidence that blacks necessarily govern worse. I often made the observation in an American TV program I was interviewed on, that why do they single out South Africa for criticism? It seems to be a sort of unintended compliment to whites. In other words, the presumption is that whites are expected to govern in a civilized, sensible manner. And if whites violate human rights and discriminate against blacks, that causes offense. But if blacks do it to blacks, that does somehow not cause offense. So that the very critics themselves do not seem to expect the same standards to be maintained by blacks, which seems to me an extremely racist view. Otherwise, you would criticize equally black governments for human rights violations, lack of democracy, lack of detention without trial, and so on and so forth. But in truth, there are countries like the Ivory Coast, which are very prosperous, countries like Malawi. Botswana is one of the few real democracies in the world. Incidentally, it's one of something like 5 countries in the world where more than 50% of the electorate actually voted for the government in power. Most Western democracies can't even claim that. So one of the few real democracies in the world happens to be a black African state. So the evidence is that there are blacks are just as capable of governing well as whites, and therefore the criticism focused on South Africa to the exclusion of criticizing black states is an unjustified racist position. Everyone should be judged by the same standards. And then finally, the question of taxation. In my model, there might be federal taxes. For example, something like a petrol tax to finance trunk roads. Or if there are import duties, it would be a customs union, and that would be a form of... that is, incidentally, until very recently, was the only form of federal tax in Switzerland. My preference would be that the customs union would have an import duty policy, but the federal government would have no other power to tax whatsoever, as it is in Switzerland. And that each canton would have its own tax system and tax policy, and those taxes would be determined by referendum in each canton.
But import duties arising on the borders of certain states, would those include the central government?
No, in Switzerland there is one federal foreign trade policy, run by, actually in Switzerland there's a 6th Department, Economic Affairs, added on to mine. I've left it out of my federal government, but you might have the Department of Finance, for example, having a tariff policy, which would be federal. It doesn't make much sense to me to have each canton with its own tariff policy, because then you'd have to have boundaries between each canton, and that restricts freedom of movement of goods and people. So that the system has to have no boundaries.
Running out of time
Yeah,
a bit
sorry.
now. Can I give Simon Fisk a chance?
Can I just make 2 quick observations that won't need a reply, and then one thing which might do. First of all, I was talking to the marketing director of Corrobrick quite recently, and he was boasting about the fact that it is in fact the largest brick manufacturer in the world. And the second one is influx control. You said that it was entirely for urban blacks. In fact, if you looked back in the old debates in agricultural history, if you go back to the old issues of the farming magazines in the 1920s and 30s, you'd find that all the call then was in fact for a thing called efflux control, to stop the blacks going away from the country districts. So in fact it was one of these things to trap people into the rural labour pool.
It's an economic policy.
Yes,
It was in fact intended to keep blacks in a white area then.
That's right. But
not to keep them out.
It was the intention of the whites to keep them there.
So it wasn't part of apartheid.
No.
That's the point. It was not intended to produce segregation.
Yeah. The third thing I want to say is something which might raise a bit more debate, is the issue of your secession. You've always tied it with your government to a land base. You talk about cantons, you talk about countries, rather than about people. There was a time when governments were definitely recognised as rulers of people. So you had the king of the Zulus, not of Zululand, and it was the king of the Normans and of the Danes and the Hittites and the Jews or whoever it was. So it was always understood until 200 or 300 years ago, right, that a ruler was a ruler of people, not of an area of the globe. And it seems that an awful lot of our problems have come since we put a territorial boundary, and many of them would disappear if in our system we had here, you don't tie it to magisterial districts, you actually tie it to groups of people. And the people can vote which leader they want as their leader. So it isn't tied to where their house is or where their property is. It's actually who they want to be ruled by.
Yeah, that's new to me, and if I criticize it by saying, for example, it seems logistically problematic. In other words, if my leader forbids pornography and yours doesn't, and we're neighbours, I'm not sure how you police it, but you know, that's probably...
Just close the curtain.
No, but I mean, say my leader forbids pornography and I happen to like pornography.
Yeah.
How does my leader stop me having access to corruption of my mind?
You just turn your backs on each other.
Yeah, I mean, you know, you've obviously thought this through and I haven't, but as you speak,
it just seems an alternate base, and government is logically a people organisation controlling people. It doesn't control land. People have
the problem is,
so logically it fits with people and not with territory.
Doesn't it come from the days when nations or peoples were rather more nomadic, and they led their group to some piece of territory, temporarily, very often?
It was the days before private ownership of any grounds and stuff like that. And it's because the only guys who had it was the feudal lords and the stuff like that. When the feudal lords' power is all broken down. So the concept is nice. The problem is that you have
private ownership today, and it's the private ownership that is important, and that is ground, lands, factories, whatever it is. And that's the important thing. You can't split those two apart.
My own preference, incidentally, is that everybody should be their own leader, and I'd like as little leaders as possible, geographic or otherwise. But anyway, that's.
Just a comment on that.
Can I hear you at the back?
Stand up.
In Ireland, where they had no government for 1,000 years, they had a combination of these factors, where people chose who their judge was going to be. They only had a legal system, no government, and their piece of ground fell under the judge of their choice. So you had a combination of these factors. But then I have two questions. The one is, Leon, what would your response be to the suggestion that a multiplicity of governments would increase the cost of government? Then in lighter vein, have you no concern for the turmoil that would be created, what I would envisage to be a canton immediately to the north of us, by your system?
Can you elaborate?
Yes.
I mean, you're getting close to my home.
That's where Ian lives.
No, a little bit further north, where all the bureaucrats are.
Oh, no. Well, now, wait a minute. You see, there's a contradiction here. Your first question was presumably raising the risk that multiplicity of government institutions entails an expansion of the bureaucracy. Your second question implies that there will be a reduction of the bureaucracy. So now, if your first question, the implicit in your first question was correct, then there's no problem in Pretoria. Then Pretoria is actually going to be running terribly short of staff, which it is already. But the truth is that in highly decentralized systems of government, like Switzerland, like America, like Canada, like Australia, Britain, in which government is decentralized to the counties, each has its own police force, each has its own education department, and so on. You have less bureaucrats, not in Britain, but certainly in Switzerland and the USA relative to other countries. And I've not looked into this, and I don't know precisely why, but certainly Switzerland is the lowest percentage of working population is employed by the state of any European country, and it's the lowest percentage of GNP comprises the budget, and it has the greatest proliferation of government.
Can I suggest?
Now, the reason I think, well, let me suggest my reason, which is just a very crude diagrammatic thing, and that is that if government is centralized, if you have a triangle from the top down, as opposed to lots of little triangles at the bottom, you're going to have more bureaucracy. In other words, the connections between the local governments and the central government, you have to have all the local administration anyway. So that the void inside the triangle at the top that has to be filled is additional bureaucracy. So it seems that devoluted government is actually less government. Because you have to have a pyramid effect, in terms of management structures and so on, each person managing 5 or 6 others or whatever all the way down. If you can pass the management down to a lower level, there's less pyramiding. That's why it seems as if you end up with less government.
Yes, put another way, you could say that the closer the taxpayer is to the civil servant whose salary he's paying, the more critical he's going to be of government.
Yeah. And then the question of what happens to the civil service. Well, I said, as Martin Spring raised, that is actually the problem to solving South Africa's politics. Is the politicians now, mostly, I think, would make a fair contribution to solving the problem if their decisions were actually carried out. And I think most people, I know some people in this room who have first-hand experience of that. I know of decisions that were made politically in 1978 that have still not been implemented and still not been announced because they haven't been implemented. And if you recall, just give you one of many examples, but it's one you will all recall. Koornoff's 3 famous bills in the 1980 session, I think it was. When Koornoff in his first or second year as Minister of Samenswering and Ontwrigting, as someone called it, Koornoff asked his officials to draw up 3 bills in his words. Now that's long ago. I mean, this is 5 years ago, before all the current reform talk, or at the beginning of it. His specific instruction was to draw up legislation to get rid of, if you recall his words were, all hurtful and unnecessary discrimination. The bills were drawn, they were tabled in Parliament, and during the second reading, various jurists started reading them, and it turned out that they made things worse, not better. Now that was intended by the chaps. I know the names of the people who drafted those bills, and I know that those people actually wanted to sabotage those reforms. It still hasn't happened. It was decided politically in the 70s, and those changes have not yet been made because of bureaucratic sabotage. So the bureaucracy is the problem. Now the solution is going to come up when I talk about the political order, but it lies in the area of public choice economics. That is what public choice economics is all about. It is how to address the economics of bureaucracy or of the civil service. And by simply finding ways of making it in the self-interest of the bureaucracy to make these change, you get them making the changes. The trouble is, at the moment, it is perceived by insiders and outsiders to be against their interests. There are quite simple techniques to make it in their self-interest, and those are ones that are in the area of public choice economics that have to be studied and implemented in South Africa. They're quite simple conceptually, and then you can think of one in any given situation. How do you make it in the interests of the rent board to discontinue rent control? They're very simple ways of doing it, really, and so on.
Perhaps we ought to make this the last question, and then we can talk some more while we're having a drink for those who have to get away.
Can I just say to Leon that all the countries that he quoted were good, have got steep income gradients. Inequality is good. Switzerland is good. And because it's got a steep gradient, it's easy to govern it. If South Africa had a steep gradient, you wouldn't have any riots at all. You know, that's the whole thing. But I'll stop there because we can go
No,
on
it's
stages.
very important. I mean, this is work that Mr. Adams has done, and it's not going to crop up again. So let's just close with this. It is very, very important that South Africa is one of the most egalitarian countries in the world, contrary to everything the left and the Marxists and so on say in terms of income gradient. And the reason why countries with a high income gradient, that is countries with a big difference between the relatively rich and poor, if you like. If you imagine a triangle, now if you imagine a hypothetically equal distribution of wealth, you'd have a very, very flat line or flat triangle with lots of people near the base. If you have a very steep income gradient, you have a steep triangle with a few people at the base and lots of people up this ladder. The reason why this is a preferred order is because the steeper the triangle, the less the number of people near the base. The less there are people who are poor. And just imagine a triangle. The higher the upward mobility, it is easy for anyone to move upwards. In a flat triangle, there is not much potential to move upwards. So there's frustration, there's necessary to fight over the division of the cake. Whereas when there's a steep triangle, it is easy to move up and get more cake. And so a steep income gradient is actually pro-peace, conflict reducing. Equal distribution of wealth is actually more conflict ridden as a social order. And any number of countries provide evidence to that effect.
Can we make this the very last?
Sorry, please, if you'll permit. I just want to ask something on a slightly different basis. The State President, Mr. Peter Ricotta, said last night, when he was confronted by the press, that the South African Defence Force had nothing to do with any violations of the Mighty Accord. And yet this morning, when the next news broadcast came on, they said, there might have been some technical violations. Now, I just want to know, we've had a couple of like these things in the past. If we think about the Cabina caper and, when 4 of our people were involved in arms embargoes, that type of thing, and now this one, aren't we losing a lot of credibility, South Africa as such?
Yes, I think it is very, very unfortunate, and I don't know what's gone wrong. I think regardless of one's attitude towards the National Party, whether you're pro or against, I think even the opponents would admit that for a long time it had a track record of reliability, honesty, whatever. I think that it seemed to be in control, even if you disagreed with the way it was using that control. It seemed to be reliable, it paid its debts, it had good housekeeping. I think a lot of people, including people within the National Party now, long-standing party loyals, are feeling very, very frustrated because that integrity seems to be in question. I don't know whether this is emergency crisis management that's doing it, but there does seem to have been a serious loss of control over their own affairs. I don't know why they're doing it. It doesn't seem to be necessary to do it. But there are people here who would have a better view of it than I do. But this is certainly, amongst many die-hard party loyals, is causing a very serious question mark. Why are these things being said that a few days later they have to admit that they lied or misrepresented or distorted or whatever? It seems predictable that they're going to be caught out. There doesn't seem to be any reason why they have to do it in the first place. I don't know.
It's very simple. They don't care.
I don't think so.
Absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Maybe, ladies and gentlemen, we're straying a little away from the topic of the lecture and more towards things that we could well discuss over a drink. So let me just, on behalf of all of us, thank you most sincerely, Leon, for blowing some cobwebs out of our minds in your usual provocative and imaginative fashion. We're most grateful. Leon will be speaking again at the same time, the same place, but a different topic on Monday night next week. I hope you'll see a lot of you here again. Let's break for a drink and continue our discussions less formally.